ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the fifth and final keynote speech of ICIIS 2021. This session will be conducted by a proud product of University of Peradeniya, and he received his PhD from the University of Cambridge, UK. Prior to his appointment in 2008, he has held faculty positions as lecturer in information engineering at the University of Cambridge and as a professor of computer science at the University of Sheffield. At Sheffield, he has also served as head of the Department of Computer Science and Dean of the Faculty of Engineering. He has a long track record of research in machine learning and has contributed to both the algorithmic and applied aspect of the subject. His current focus of research is in inference problems in the domain of computational biology. He is none other than Professor Mahesan Niranjan. Sir, this invitation is for you to deliver the keynote address.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, very many thanks to the organizers of the conference for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be back in Peradeniya. That makes me very happy. But of course, I'm sad that I'm not physically present there. My ideal way of participating in this conference would have been to actually travel there, stay in a hotel in Kandy, walk along the Galaha Road, have a plain tea and vade at the Gemba canteen, and then walk across the bridge to the faculty and do the talk. So now none of that is going to happen. So we'll try and make the best of what we have here. Okay. So that was quite generous introduction. That's slightly exaggerated, but thank you very much for that. Let me try and share my screen and see what I'm up to today. Share. Okay, do you see my screen with a PDF?
Yes, sir, we can see the screen.
Okay, so the title I have chosen is a random walk through the foundations of deep learning. I mean, so your conference has a theme. It has the theme is deep learning and what are things you would get out of it. So my focus is going to be on the foundations of this subject. And I'll set out my view of the subject of machine learning initially. And then I'll go and look at why the current developments in deep learning, how they pitch or how can they be placed in the context of the subject of machine learning, how recent developments in deep learning fit into that current into the context of deep learning. So that would be kind of the objective, and I'll do that by I've claimed I'm going to do a random walk, and it's only a random walk that is possible in this field because developments in machine learning have been enormous. The volume of literature that's coming through is massive, and one cannot do justice to the whole of the subject. So what we will do is we'll look at what are basic ideas in machine learning and try to pitch some random recent developments into that framework so that you get an idea of what's going on here. And then you will be able to build on this and catch up if you have infinite energy with all the literature that's happening at the moment. So that would be the starting point. So it's some recent excitements. And of course, I'm not going to stop if I'm given a platform not to talk about the things that interest me in this context. And quite a lot of things that interest me have to do with outliers. So I like to find things that don't fit a normal pattern or normal model. Whereas bulk of the literature on machine learning, deep learning is about accurately predicting something that happens normally. I would like to look at things that are slightly outside what you can find by fitting models to data and whether you can interpret those outliers that are coming out. And I'll give you a good example of that that we worked on recently. And I'll look at two versions of this. One is what happens in a regression setting and as structured matrix approximations of these. So that would be the plan for the day. Okay. Okay, so the subject of machine learning is a tricky one. It's tricky because unlike physics, chemistry, biology, it doesn't have that long a history, or mathematics, it doesn't have that long a history. But it's a little bit like a combination of many, many things. It's each one of these and much more than a combination of these things. So it is possible to have my friends in statistics are perfectly entitled to tell me that, hey, everything you're doing has been known in statistics, and this is what we statisticians do. People in optimizations are perfectly entitled to say, hey, you're all the time in machine learning optimizing something, and this is perhaps the only thing that you seem to be doing. If someone comes into my lab and watches me from a system identification perspective, they would think that's all what I'm doing. I'm identifying systems through data. And of course, all these things have to be written in good software. And developments in any of these fields, and a very rich combination of developments in any of these fields, is what I see as the subject of machine learning. So it is actually better than the sum of all these parts. But those of us working in this subject are drawing inspiration, drawing tools from any of these subjects as and when we need them. Okay, so that's the starting point. The whole idea of the subject of machine learning is about extracting useful information from very large and complex data sets. Now, large and complex has to be taken in context. Sometimes large is, maybe this is hiding me, so I'll keep it this way. What is large? What is complex is very much context dependent. Words don't have absolute meaning. Words have to be interpreted in context. So you might imagine it's the term modeling. So modeling has to do with modeling comes in various ways. So if you think of an architect who wants to put up a building, what does the architect do? They build a scaled version of the building they want to build, go and have a look at it. And if it looks pretty, then they might decide to go and put up a building. So civil engineers next door to you want to build a bridge or something. They would make a model of it, a physical model of this, and then try to bash it. And if it doesn't break, then they will go and build the bridge. So those are modeling. That's a kind of modeling. Computational modeling that has developed over a period of time coming from literature such as physics is about saying, what do I understand about the process that I'm trying to model? Okay, so there may be frictions, there may be viscosity, there may be pressure, temperature, all these things. And we might understand that we might know that there are actual laws of physics that govern how these things interact, how molecules interact, how things fly if you hit things with how hard and so on. So we might write differential equations that capture our understanding of the physics of what's going on. And there's huge amounts of computational modeling of cell cycles, of how pollution diffuses, or how the weather happens, or how cells grow and divide. And the way we do that is to write differential equations that describe how things happen. And that's mechanistic modeling based on our understanding of the physical processes that govern that. And then we would solve these differential equations in the simple cases analytically, in very, very few simple cases, in more complex cases by numerical methods. And our solution to those equations is the explanation for the world. And we might think of doing predictions from this. We might think of those models to do interventions. So we might ask questions like, what if I change this? Now that I have modeled this phenomena, will temperature go up by 1.5 degrees next year? Or will the stock market collapse next year? Are kind of questions we would ask by intervening in the model. Machine learning is slightly different in the sense that we are interested in data-driven modeling. So what we think is that our problem formulation starts with a lot of data. And that's what I have written here as X and Y. So you have given me n, uppercase N amounts of data. And you can think of X as going into some system, an input to a system, and Y as an output from that system. So you've given me some input-output relationships, and you want me to learn something from this data that you have collected. And from that data that you have collected, make some predictions or try to understand what the world is doing. Sometimes these Ys that you are giving me as output are discrete valued labels. They are symbols telling me each of those X's belong to a certain class. It could be X's could be images or features that I derive from images. And the Ys could be something like, is this image that of a tree or a helicopter or a car or whatever? Yeah. So those are labels. And if these are labels, then the problem that you're trying to give me is known as a classification problem, as you will know. Sometimes these Ys are real value, and it could be about temperature tomorrow. It could be about the stock price tomorrow, and you'll be posing a regression problem to me. So both these classification and regression problems in this setting are examples of what I would call supervised learning problems, right? So the Ys, what information you give me in the Y about the X is something I would see as a supervision signal. Okay? Sometimes you will make life difficult for me by saying that it's not moving. Okay, it's moving if I hit my keyboard a bit harder. Sometimes you will give me only the X and you won't give me any Y. So when you give me only the X, so I might still be able to say something even without a supervision signal. And what are things I might do? These X's may be measured in some high dimensional space. And I might be interested in asking, how are these X's distributed? Are they all in one part of the space, or are they spread out all over the place? Are they sharply peaked, or are they spread out? Or is there a cluster structure in the way these X's are distributed? Would be a question I can ask. And based on that, I can make a statement about the world. I can quantize and build low compression schemes. I can do all sorts of things by studying the distribution of these X's. Sometimes these X's may be in high dimensions, because these days it's very, very easy to collect data. So you might have collected all sorts of unnecessary data and put these X's in some high dimensional space. Or it may well be that your measurement space is in high dimensions, necessarily in high dimension, but you might have reason to suspect that the underlying information beneath that is actually in a lower dimensional space. In that case, I might want to reduce the dimensions of this. And by reducing the dimensions of this, I might be able to do some useful things. Okay. And if I were doing that, that comes in what I might call unsupervised learning problems. The outlier detection problem that interests me a lot falls largely in this category. And that is, you have given me lots of data that characterizes normal behavior of something. It could be a very complex engine that's behaving in a particular way normally, or it could be as strong an engine as the human body. So you may be monitoring a patient in a hospital in intensive care with loads and loads of instruments, and you might know under normal conditions how this patient, our body would behave. You may be interested in finding abnormal patterns, abnormal behaviors that happen once in a while, very rarely. So both in the case of a human and in the case of a very complex engine, I might not be able to collect data similar to this. That is, these are normal behaviors of the human, and these are abnormal behaviors because I have created some trouble to the human, and the human is behaving unreasonably. Or in a very complex engine, I will not be allowed to run that engine under abnormal behaving conditions. So what I might be interested in is capturing the density of normal behavior, and then finding tools that will tell me how I might be able to predict abnormal behavior when I see that. So how might I set about doing it? The most simplest way of thinking about this is, of course, is to say I want to capture the density of this and score the likelihood of any of this data with respect to the density that I'm imposing on this. And you give me a new data point. I would check this against the density. Is the likelihood of seeing this data high, in which case I would say it's normal. And if the likelihood of seeing that data is very, very low, below a threshold, I might cut a threshold and say, well, it doesn't, this data is new, it's abnormal, the engine is faulty, or the patient is about to die, or some such conclusion you could reach, okay? Something very fundamental hits us when we think about this right at that stage. Density modeling is notoriously difficult when you try to do this in high dimensions. So imagine that you want to model the probability density of something, and you want to do this in one dimension. You want to leave evidence of a probability density. How might you do that? You will take this dimension, you will split that into equal parts, and then count how many of this data lies in each of these, and that will characterize your density. And that, of course, is a histogram, and we all know what a histogram is. Now, suppose your data is not in 1 dimension, it's in 2 dimensions. Then what will you do? You will take this 2-dimensional space and split it into regular grids this way and that way, and count how many data fall into each of these little grids, and that is your measure of the density of this 2-dimensional histogram. Of course, if you have 3, then you have to split the world into cubes and do exactly the same thing. Now, if it's known that if you, as you go to higher and higher dimensions, to preserve the same precision with which you characterize the density, the amount of data that you need grows exponentially. And because the amount of data you need grows exponentially, it is extremely difficult to characterize probability densities at high dimensions. Just someone, can you give me feedback whether when I switched off the sharing and come back, is it coming back here? Are you able to see the slides?
Yes, Niranjan, we are.
And is my pointer visible when I move it around?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so what I said was that density estimation in high dimensions is notoriously difficult, and that difficulty maps onto what's known as the curse of dimensionality. Okay, regression classification problems tend to be easier to solve than density estimation problems, precisely for that reason of the curse of dimensionality. Okay, so now staying with the supervised learning paradigm, the kind of things I could say now is that what would I want to do? Okay, so my keyboard seemed to be stuck. So, okay, that's better. Okay, so what I would want to do is that I would think that there is some reason to believe in this supervised learning paradigm. If you stick to this one, there is reason to believe that the XY relationships that underlies the process that's generating the data is something I can approximate by a function. So I'm going to fit a function through the XY relationship, and this function is parameterized by some parameters theta, and there is some noise in the process. And because I think that this data is not coming completely random, this is being generated from some physical mechanism that generates this, I can accept that there will be some smoothness constraints with respect to that physical system. Physical systems tend to be smooth, they're not all over the place. So, and that belief is what enables me to fit a function through this, and a parameterized function through this, and hope that I can do something useful. If I didn't have that belief about some level of smoothness, I don't have a start here, okay? Once I try to fit this function, and because you have given me this data, what I would immediately do is to calculate what are the best values of these parameters theta in my model, so that I can minimize some error. Okay, so what I have written here is a very simple error. It's the difference between what the target is, or what the response is, and what my model gave me at each of those xn's. I compute the difference, I take the square of them, I add them over all the data. That gives me a loss function. I use this loss function. If I minimize this loss function, I have found the theta that best fits this model to the data that you gave me. Okay, now that's just a fitting exercise. That itself is not particularly useful. What is useful is to be able to make predictions. And the predictions that you would want to make would always be on unseen data. And that's an important point, that you gave me data that is up to n going from 1 to n. And the prediction that you require me to do is on n+1, uppercase n+1, using theta hat, which is the theta I have estimated by minimizing this error. So how well can I make this prediction is what you're going to judge me on in the way I'm going to model this data that you gave me. So obviously you can immediately see something interesting here, that just by making this function more and more complex all the time, for a fixed amount of data that you gave me, I can bring this error down to 0. I can very easily think of a very, very complex function that is sufficiently complex that will fit all the data that you give me perfectly. And it's kind of intuitive that if that's what you can do this in a number of ways, of course, then this is not going to do well in predicting unseen data. So what would we do? We would try and regularize and control the complexity that this function can give us. And how would we regularize this? we would minimize not just the error on the data that you gave me, but I will have the penalty function that I impose on the parameters. So I might say that the parameters cannot take arbitrary values. They have to satisfy some constraints so that this function will not be arbitrarily complex and fit and memorize all the data that you gave me. Okay, so that's the idea of regularization. Now, I have come to this entirely from talking only about data, but there is more to it than that. Sometimes this regularizer gives me a handle with which I can impose some prior knowledge about the problem into this fitting exercise. So I can choose this regularizer in such a way that if I believed that this function that should come out should be very smooth, then I can impose a prior regularizer that will achieve that. If I have reason to think that this function should not be in terms of all the variables that you gave me, but only a small number of them, I might induce some sparsity into this exercise, and I can choose a regularizer such that the resulting function is a sparse function. Sparse means it's only dependent on a small number of the features that you gave me, not on all of them. Okay, so even though I started by saying that this is about modeling, data-driven modeling, and not about our prior understanding of the physics of the process, I have a handle through which I can inject prior knowledge about what's going on, not always, but most of the time. Okay. And then, of course, in all this, there is a lot of uncertainty. So I'm saying I have chosen a function here. That function will have some parameters. Those parameters are coming from somewhere. So how many parameters are there? What kind of function am I going to use? What's the noise in the process? What are the effects of my learning algorithm that minimizes this objective function? All these things map into uncertainty. What's more, you have also given me data that is perhaps just one realization of the underlying process. You ran the engine a couple of times and produced this data, or you went out there with a camera and collected some data from natural images. There's just one realization of that underlying image generating mechanism, right? So there are huge sources of uncertainty, and one of my jobs would be to recognize what are these sources of uncertainty and how can I quantify them, so that I don't just make a prediction on the unseen data that you give me. I make a predictive distribution, and that predictive distribution captures how confident am I or how uncertain am I about the models, about the predictions that I'm making. And to do that, what we will do is not just estimate one value for parameters by minimizing this error, but we will characterize the uncertainty over all that parameters by a probability density. Okay, so this is the probability density over all the parameters, which is conditioned on all the data that you gave me with which I'm starting. Okay, now if I can do this one, from this I can make predictions which also capture uncertainty, which will be predictive distributions. What sort of inferences would I make from that? The way I would make inferences, once you give me this P of theta, which is the density over all the parameters, the kind of inferences one would make is some function of those parameters, because over those parameters, I have a distribution. So at every point, I can make a prediction, which has to be weighted by the probability mass in that region. So the predictions I make tend to be expectations over some functions. And that expectation, of course, can be written out as the function multiplied by the density integrated over that entire space. Okay, so now when you write an integral like that, that's extremely difficult. You can't really do this in the simplest of cases, except in the simplest of cases analytically. So you need better machinery to do that, and you go into sampling-based methods. And what sampling-based methods do is to sample a number of these parameter values. In that space, you pick loads and parameters, and each of those parameters is picked, but it's sampled according to this probability density P of theta. So if in that parameter space you have a distribution, you sample according to that distribution, and at each of those values of those samples, compute the function and average it. Okay, so this average would be an approximation to the function, to the integral that you should have done. So there's a huge amount of literature on Markov chain Monte Carlo. How would you sample from this distribution? How would you average this to approximate this integral? Just the same way we talked about curse of dimensionality, there's a dimensionality issue here. the accuracy with which such a sampling method, such an average, approximate this distribution depends largely on the number of samples you draw from this distribution and not on the dimensionality of theta. Okay. As a result, this sampling method works, and the curse of dimensionality I spoke about earlier does not hurt us because we are only interested in the expectation and we are not interested in how precisely I characterize that density for use by somebody else. Okay, that's probabilistic inference. I told you at the beginning that you are giving me all this much of data, uppercase N of data of XY pairs, but sometimes you might want to make my life even more, a little bit more difficult by saying, I'm not going to give you all this data in one go. I'm going to give them to you one by one. Okay. And the task you're going to set me is that I want to learn from all the data I have seen up to some point in time. And based on what I have learned, make some predictions. And then the next point in time, do the same thing again, do the same thing again. And electrical engineers in the room will know about adaptive filters, do just the same thing. Okay. And that's sequential estimation. And that is very, very important and popular topic in machine learning. And the sort of things one would do in that is to say, okay, so this theta that I'm after, what is my estimate of theta at time n-1 in a sequential setting using all the data that I have seen up to time n-1? And from that, I would make a prediction as to what this theta would look like at time n, but using all the data up to time n-1, the previous point in time. And then, of course, with that prediction, I might be able to take some action. I might go and say, I don't know, I want to buy some stock, or I want to turn the robots to look in a particular direction, or whatever. Yeah. But then the next point in time, after taking that action, I have a new data. And when I use that new data, I will have an estimate of the parameters at time n, but now using all the data up to time n. Okay, so there's a prediction, correction, and many of you will recognize this as in the linear Gaussian setting. That is, if I knew that the dynamics of how things change over time is linear, and any disturbing noise of this form is Gaussian, then this prediction correction can be done very in a straightforward way by what's known as the common filter. But as soon as you relax any of those assumptions that the dynamics is not linear, or if the disturbing noise is not Gaussian, then the common filter will not work. And there are approximate methods in the form of extended common filter and so on. And there are also non-parametric methods in the form of particle filters. And the non-parametric methods are essentially sequential versions of Markov chain Monte Carlo type integrals. I guess that's again a very rich literature. On top of all that, so now we have talked about regression classification problems, density estimation, dimensionality reduction type problems as problem formulations. But not all problems fall into this. These are essentially some kind of static problems. You are given a bunch of data, either as a batch or sequentially arriving, and you want to learn a mapping. Okay, with immediate signals that are available to you, either in the form of a response variable or in the form of distance measures when you do density estimation. Okay, but there are fascinating problems around where you don't have that kind of static mapping or density estimation type constraints, but you're faced with planning problems. And those are the places where machine learning touches artificial intelligence in a real sense somehow. And examples of those such planning problems are complex games like chess and Go and games like that, where the underlying issue is that you don't have immediately access to a target, but you have to go through a series of moves. As in when you play chess, you make a move, your opponent makes a move, then you make a move, your opponent makes a move. And then after 40 moves, you get a reward that tells you, you get a result that tells you whether you have won or lost. At every step of the game, based on a little move that you make, you know immediately there is a small reward. You might say, okay, I've captured the pawn or I've captured the queen or something. You can see that your position has improved a little bit. But then you have also changed the position of the board. You've also given the opponent some other opportunities. So even though you immediately have an idea whether the move that you made makes some sense, what matters is the long term, what happens in the long term as a result of a sequence of moves that you make. Okay, and those kind of problems come under the banner of reinforcement learning. So as opposed to supervised, unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning is a topic in which there is huge amounts of activity at the moment, and playing very complex games like, I don't know, Atari games of on computer screens, or chess or Go have been huge advances that happened in recent times. Whereas that kind of problem formulation is combined with the kind of function approximations that we talked about earlier. Okay, so that's my take on what the subject of machine learning is. And I think some of you know that I have made the claim that this slide contains just about everything to do with machine learning that you will ever hear. And that this slide actually could have been written 30 years ago or 35 years ago when I started as a PhD student. Okay, and this slide is equally valid today. So what has changed? If this is the total take on the subject of machine learning, let's look at this slide and let us ask ourselves, what are recent developments and how do we pitch it here? And what leads to all the excitement that we see around us? Okay, so let me go right back to the first line here. So we talked about supervised learning problems. We talked about unsupervised learning problems. And we said in supervised learning problems, you're given a target. In unsupervised learning problems, you're not given a target. There are appearing many interesting problems where only part of the data consists of targets. So there could be various reasons for this. You might want to label, say, medical images and work on a problem of doing diagnosis from medical images. But the medical consultants who you would call upon to label these images as having particular illness, they are very busy people. They're very expensive people. Okay, so they might be willing to label some of the images that they have given you. But then if you ask them to label the whole data set, they will say, go away. Okay. So you are left with part of the data that's labeled on which you have targets that tell you that these images have this particular illness. These images don't have this particular illness. But you also have next to it loads and loads of images that you have acquired, which your consultant medic hasn't got the chance or got the time or the money. You don't have money to pay that person to label all those images. So what do? So you are faced with what one would call a semi-supervised learning problem, because you have part of the data labeled. You can solve a supervised learning problem, but in that domain, you have unlabeled data. So the question then is, can I take advantage of the availability of this unlabeled data to do a better job of solving a supervised learning problem? So that's a semi-supervised learning paradigm. It works in two directions. One direction is to say, can I build a supervised learning solution taking advantage of the availability of unsupervised learning data? The other way it works, and that's very common, that's very popular in recent deep learning literature, is I want to build a model of unsupervised learning. And the model of unsupervised learning I want to build is essentially a generative model. Can I think of a model that's capable of generating data? Okay, and that model would be a probabilistic model, and that probabilistic model will tell you generating these data have these corresponding likelihoods. So if this is a generative model of human faces, if you generate a face, something that looks like a face, then it will score high likelihood with respect to that model. The question then is, can I exploit my expertise in solving unsupervised learning problems to build a better generative model of data? And that comes under the GAN type, generative adversarial network type architectures that people talk about very recently. So what would one do? One would say, I want to build a good generative model that generates data looking like faces. So what I would do is, but you have given me a small number of faces to work with. So I would run this model in a way that I would generate data, the model generates data, and I have some real data, and I want to discriminate between the real data and the data that is fake that's coming from the model. And if I fail to discriminate between them correctly, then I have built a good generative model. Are you with me on the argument? The argument says to me that my purpose is to generate a model, to build a generative model of data. You have given me some data. And what I would want to do is to generate data that is not separable, not discriminable from the real data that you gave me. If I impose such a constraint and solve that problem, I would build a better generative model than simply computing likelihoods of data out of a parametric model that I impose on this. So that's working two ways. That is, I can exploit the availability of unlabeled data to build a better discriminant model, or I can take advantage of my expertise in building discriminant models to build a good generative model. Okay, so that's a particular kind of problem formulation. What are other things? There is another problem formulation. We talk supervised, semi-supervised, unsupervised, semi-supervised. So in that line, there is a technique called self-supervised. And that's, okay, I'll come back to that a little bit later, okay, because I have a slide on that. We have interest in function approximators. So what are good function approximators? I just very vaguely said we want to fit a function because we think the things are smooth. So until in very early days of machine learning, we were working primarily with linear functions, and huge amounts of work has happened with linear regression, logistic regression, and so on, perceptron learning algorithm for classification. These were all solving linear functions. Those were very, very simple. Then came along around the 80s, early 90s, we were working with multi-layer perceptrons. We knew that if you had a model that has neuron-like elements stuck together, just one hidden layer, there is an input, a hidden, and an output layer, a layered structure. In that hidden layer, if you make it large enough, then subject to a certain number of smoothness constraints, any arbitrary function could be approximated to some arbitrary precision that you give me. As long as you don't constrain how many hidden units I have in that hidden layer, I can approximate any function that you give me to an arbitrary precision. Okay, so that kept the community engaged for quite some time. So a single hidden layer multi-layer perceptron was the one that was most used in the literature. More recently comes the deep idea, which is a topic of your conference. So what would we do? Instead of having just one hidden layer, we would have a large number of layers in a network. Why did we not do that before in the 80s, 90s?
Hello, Niranjan.
Sorry?
Which slide were you meant to be?
Oh, I'm still showing the single slide that I have.
All good, okay.
Yeah, is my cursor moving?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
So when we talk about this function was for a long time, it built around a single hidden layer, multi-layer perceptron. But we would have wanted to have deeper models even in the 80s, 90s, but there were technical issues that stopped us from doing that. So remember I talked about optimizing this to compute values of these parameters. So if you stick many of, so how would we do this? If we had nonlinear functions here, this optimization is complex, and the only way you can do this by gradient search. So you would start from some random guess of all these parameters, and then little by little compute the gradient of this, update your guess, and little by little descend until you found a local minimum of this function in the case of nonlinear models stuck here. And the algorithm that was going to do that for us was backpropagation or error propagation, as you would have heard, which tells you I compute the derivative of the output error, which is this one, with respect to each of the weights in each of these layers, propagated backwards so that the gradients with respect to each of the weights in each of the layers gets computed. And when we do that with nonlinear functions, and the typical nonlinear functions used at that time were sigmoidal functions, these sigmoidal functions saturate near 1 and 0 when you go far away from the origin. They very quickly saturate towards 1 and 0. And if a sigmoid saturates, then you will immediately know that the gradient of that is very, very small. So if you build multi-layer functions, then when you keep computing the gradient going backwards, you are going to multiply by small values many times. And when you multiply by small values, the results get smaller and smaller, and very rapidly you get to very, very low values. And when you get to those very low values and had built a multi-layer model here, then the early layers are not going to learn much because the gradients are very, very small. Okay, so that vanishing gradient problem was one reason why we did not go for multi-layer models. Okay. We now have tools by which we can fudge that. We can avoid that. Instead of using sigmoidal nonlinearities, quite a lot of the deep learning literature now use a rectified linear unit nonlinearities. A rectified linear unit nonlinearity will be 0 up to 0, and it's linear beyond 0. Okay. So by those little tricks, we are able to now construct functions that are deep and very multi-layers. What are reasons we think this is good? The reasons we think this is good is that these multiple layers are taking the data that comes into it through a series of transformations. And these transformations are such that towards the end, you find a space in which the data that's in the original is represented quite well. So it's a representation learning problem. And that representation is good to classify, I don't know, apples from oranges, from grapes and bicycles, as much, much better than in the original space of pixel values of apples and oranges and grapes and bicycles. Okay, so that representation learning, when you construct deep architectures, is thought to be very, very good. There's quite a lot of work recently. Okay, so let me then go into some of the other slides that I have. And this is now very interesting. I started by saying you gave me data, X and Y, and I'm just thinking an Euclidean space in which real value data exists. But this is not what a lot of the useful data is. In a lot of the useful data could be natural languages, so that's text. It could be very unstructured. It could be sentences in documents. I work a lot with biological sequences, so that's sequence of amino acids or sequence of nucleic acids. Molecular structures of small chemical molecules or proteins, large proteins. We could talk about the molecules as strings. So there are representations of molecules which are strings of alphabets, and there are molecular representations that are graphs, which atom is connected to which atom and so on. So graphs, sequences, text, documents, these are all unstructured kind of data, which is not in a simple form of an Euclidean space. So in the past, what we would do is we would use feature extraction from these. So we would take a protein sequence, and we will say, or we'll take a text sequence, that's an easier example, and say, let's count the number of words that are in each of these documents, stick them in the bag, and call it a bag of words representation, which is now in an Euclidean space. I've taken the dictionary. The dictionary has 20,000 words in it, say. On any document that you give me, I count how many times each of these words exist. And then I'm mapping a document into a 20,000 dimensional space. So that's the bag of words idea. In chemistry, fingerprints of features are very common. So you give me a molecule, and chemists would tell me what are different features that these molecules have, how many carbon atoms, how many nitrogen atoms, what atom is connected to what atom, and so on. So I might build a long binary string, which I might call a fingerprint, that represents the molecule, so that I go into a fixed dimensional space in which everything I showed you in the previous slide would work. With amino acid sequences, people have used bags of trigrams of amino acids as a very common. So this is then what we used to do in the 80s, early 90s, mid 90s, and so on. Okay, so features derived from known properties and so on. We would take data that is not in a standard Euclidean form and convert it by extracting features of it or counting how many times they occur and so on. We do something very different now. What we do now is to say, can we learn continuous valued representations that somehow capture the context in which these symbols occur? So in natural language, sentences are formed of words, but words don't occur in isolation. Words always occur in context, carrying meaning in context, and controlled by the grammar of the language that determines what a correct construct of a sentence is going to be. Okay, so there is a lot more information about the word than whether the word occurred or not, or how many times that word occurred in that document. Can we capture that? And that is what self-supervised learning is about. But the idea then is to say, I'm going to have, so I've drawn this picture for protein sequences and trigrams of protein sequences. So imagine along this line is a long length of protein, which consists of amino acids A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and so on. I'm going to take 3 of them at a time, and I'm going to build a representation of a combination of 3 amino acids in a vector space. This is my job. What I know is that these amino acids don't occur in isolation. Proteins evolved over a period of time or over generations. So there's some contextual information that I could capture. So what I would do is to remove the guy in the middle, remove this trigram in the middle, feed this one, this one, this one, this one in, and ask the question, if I'm given A, B, C, D, E, F, J, K, L, and M, N, O, what is the best trigram that can sit in the middle? Okay, and I know that in the training data, I know that. I know that GHI is the trigram that sits in the middle. But maybe in another protein sequence, when you see A, B, C, D, E, F, J, K, L, M, N, O, something else might sit in the middle. Okay? So I would train up a model here that will predict what can sit in the middle, constrained by the context that is around it. Yeah? And in doing that, what is the probability of each of these given the surrounding context? I will learn in the hidden units of this neural network some good representation of GHI. So now GHI, in terms of the hidden units, if we say there are 3 hidden units of the neural net, GHI is going to be mapped into an Euclidean space as a vector. So I've started with symbols. GHI is a symbol of amino acids, and I have a vector representation of that in an Euclidean space. Okay, and that self-supervised learning of pulling out features is very popular, very common, immensely powerful, very widely used in language, natural language processing, as under the topic of word-to-vec, came up within the last 5 to 10 years or so. But that has sprung huge amounts of activity in representing DNA sequences, proteins, molecules, graphs, 3-dimensional molecular structures, just about everything you can think of, where you have reason to believe that the data is not occurring in isolation, like in the very first line of my first slide. This data appears in the context, and that context is defined in the case of natural languages by grammar and semantics of what you contain, in the case of biology by evolution, and in the case of chemistry by chemical structures. Okay, so that's a very, very common, a very widely used and immensely powerful thing that is modern as opposed to what I had in my slide of 10 years ago. Other things, now I can run very rapidly through what I have. We can think of filters as feature extractors. This is again known. We have been doing this for some time. And instead of pulling out, we can define a whole bunch of filters. And each of these filters, say, for example, convolving with an image, would pull out features, and that gives us, I think I'm losing part of my slides, never mind. We have learned that convolutions are immensely powerful in the context of processing signals like images, speech, and even language and protein sequences. We have learned that adding depth helps a lot. We just talked about it a minute ago. We'll take images, we take them through a series of convolutions, and we map them onto a space in which different classes of images, like bicycles and fruits, appear in different corners of this last FC7 stage. Okay. And you will know as you go through this, if you have loads of filters here, then you expand the dimensionality. There are tricks by which you would reduce the dimensionality back again and so on. And it's very, very common to build hugely deep architectures of this form to pull out useful information from this. And this WaveNet is precisely the same kind of idea, but for signals, one-dimensional signals. And then there are tricks on top of it. I mean, if you knew that you want to take close by samples to predict the next one, you will define a convolution filter that does that. If you think you want to take distant samples, data here and that one and this one taking from here, then you can dilate the convolution filter that you impose, and you have plenty of freedom to design the architecture of the filter that pulls out the kind of information that you want to pull out. Okay, so that's just the wavelet architecture. Then we want to look at time. Time becomes an extremely important thing. And right in the early stages of neural net type research, we already had ways of doing feedback into neural nets as recurrent neural nets to take care of time. So the past becomes mapped in. But nowadays, there are very, very specific architectures with which you can strike a differential balance between how far back you look, how much importance you give to recent past, and how much importance you give to distant past. Okay, and that's the prior you have about the problem domain. And there are very specific architectures you can draw from with which you can impose those constraints that come from your prior knowledge. Once you have all these really large models, how do you control them? How do you control the fact that they don't just memorize the training data that you give you? There is a whole bunch of tricks by which we can do this. Weight decay is one of them. You don't allow the weights of those models to take arbitrary values, arbitrary large values. You might constrain them to take small values. You might formulate a problem that I might call a multitask learning problem. So remember we started with X and Y, X goes in, Y comes out. You may be solving a problem where X goes in, and you may want to predict Y1 and Y2, two different tasks, both predicted from X, and this is the problem that you're trying to solve. Now, you can do this in two ways, of course. You can just solve the Y1 problem first, then you can solve with another network the Y2 problem and say, I have two models. You give me X, this model predicts Y1, this model predicts Y2. You're allowed to do this. But it turns out that if you try to do them simultaneously, and if there's actually a statistical relationship between, statistical or functional relationship between Y1 and Y2, you can do an awful lot better. You can do better because you're exploiting in your architecture the relationship between Y1 and Y2. And how would you do this? You have a hidden layer that is shared for both tasks, and you have hidden layers here that are specific just to these tasks. So anything common gets captured here, and anything specific gets captured here, and the model takes advantage that over here, you're pulling out things that are common, a common representation to both these. Okay. Then, of course, early stopping is a very valid and well-known technique. And here is something that's very interesting. So this one is to say, you have built this massive network with huge number of layers and parameters. You want to train this. When you train this, you want to control the way it behaves. And a little trick that people worked out is that every time you pass the gradients to train, you switch off half the network, or a third of the network, say. At random, you switch off part of the networks and keep training the ones that are left. So let's drop out. For some time, we thought, hey, this looks like magic. But now we understand this an awful lot better. What we know there is that it is actually equivalent. If during every pass you switch off part of the network, that is equivalent, that the result it achieves is equal to having multiple models and averaging the outputs. Yeah? Both in a classic frequentist sense, and also there is literature that puts that in a Bayesian perspective. The idea would be to say that, okay, so if you are tasked with solving a problem, you don't just solve one with a single model. You might want to try multiple models on these and weight them somehow and combine them. When you run multiple models, if those models make uncorrelated errors, then combining them is always good. That's guaranteed to be good. Something very similar to that happens during this trick of dropout. You just say, as I pass gradients, I just remove half the network, and at random, the effect of that is the same as running multiple models and averaging. So even though I have thought at the beginning of a very, very large network, I'm not using the whole thing as something that fits all your training data and just memorizing it. I have tricks by which I can control its behavior, and that behavior here is the same as having multiple models and averaging. On this, something that interests me quite a lot is to train models in a cascade way, that I don't train all these models in a at the same time as end-to-end, input here, output here, model the whole thing. We are interested in modeling things in a cascade way. So initially we train one hidden layer, then freeze that, freeze the second one, freeze that, freeze the third one, and so on. There are a couple of advantages that we get out of this. One is complexity of memory and computation, and we can achieve the same performance as end-to-end with this kind of training. But one more important is what we were trying to look at is, if you force networks to learn layer by layer, what do you think you achieve? You achieve early layers to learn very broad coarse features and later layers to learn very fine grained features. Okay, so those are some of the things. And then when you go back to unsupervised learning, in just 1 minute, I'll just say that we can take data, you can build an encoder, you can build a decoder, and to recreate the same data. If you now train a model like this, you're forcing this data through a bottleneck here to generate this data approximately over here. Okay? And that enables you to learn a representation of this data from which a decoder is able to generate this. So remember right at the beginning, I talked about lower dimensions in which the data may live. That's what this is. You might have measured three things about the data in a three-dimensional system, but the underlying data lives in a nonlinear manifold, which looks just 2 dimensions. So if this is linear, we know that this is principal component analysis. We can do that with nonlinear models and capture that kind of variation also in a probabilistic setting. Okay, I'm going to now stop sharing. I've been looking at the time. I think I have covered quite a lot of little things to map on my simple 1-slide view of machine learning. And from that, we can look at many recent developments, and on each of those developments, ask the question, where does it fit? What is new? And what are we pulling out of it? Quite a lot is happening in this field because applications like computer vision, natural language processing are pulling this. Quite a lot is also happening because just by looking at complex architectures, how do we train them? What are things we can do to control their capacity and their behavior? How can we inject prior knowledge into them? Those are becoming extremely interesting issues. The applications is pulling in a very big way. We have heard about computer games playing problems. The world's Go champion has stopped playing Go because he can't beat the computer anymore. Similarly, we have solved problems like protein folding problems very recently. DeepMind announced their AlphaFold system you would have heard about. A 50-year-old unsolvable problem just solved plainly by building a very large deep neural network and learning a mapping between the sequences that are the X's and the structures that are the Y's, and all the tricks that are available to us with very large models, how to train them, how to capture features from them into that prediction system. So these are remarkable achievements of recent times. They all fit into very simple, elegant, structured frameworks. But like I said right at the beginning, the field is very mature and is able to do this because we are drawing strength from many well-established disciplines like probability and statistical inference, like functional approximation, like optimization, ideas of dynamical systems, and all this put in very good software engineering and hardware that goes with it to train these very large models. I think I'm going to stop there before running out of time and take any quick questions if you have time, if I have time for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. If the participants have any questions, they can ask now.
Hello? Am I muted?
No, sir. We can hear you.
Okay, so what would you like? Is there if anyone has questions, very quickly, because I think we are running out of time. Okay, so thank you very much. I think we have hit the end. I wish I had gone a little bit, timed myself a little bit better and covered a bit more about what I do, but I think I ran out of time, but are we right on time now, right?
Yes, sir, yes.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir. So on behalf of, I would like to extend my thanks for the informative and in-depth talk, because I'm certain all the participants were able to gather valuable knowledge on the foundations and the fundamentals of the deep learning. So also on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to extend our gratitude for taking your time from your busy schedule to be here with us today. Thank you, sir.
Very good. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being with you, but it would have been nicer if I had been able to travel to Peradeniya.
Yes, of course. And before winding up, there are some announcements. Okay. The closing ceremony will be held today at 6, and it will consist of a small guest paper award ceremony as well. And the organizing committee would like to invite you all to join with us and join the closing ceremony using the same link that you used to join for this session.
Okay, so 6 p.m. Yeah.
Yes. And with that, we have come to the conclusion of the final keynote speech of ICIIS 2021. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.